The midlife crisis. I'm sure that when I say this, many of us picture a guy buying a sports car, maybe a convertible sports car, leaving his spouse, getting back into the nightlife, and dating a much younger person than him, or at least trying to date a much younger person than him. Now, this is a stereotype, of course, and one that, from the people I've spoken with, is very common. But what is a midlife crisis then, if not a stereotype? I'm a woman in midlife, and I recognize that I'm in a moment that some might judge to be a midlife crisis, which makes me wonder, what is a midlife crisis, and what is a midlife crisis for women? How do we know if we're in one? Is there really an experience that is common to all people in midlife that we're calling a midlife crisis? In today's episode, we're going to unpack the midlife crisis and explore what it is for those of us who identify as women and who have reached their crisis point. So stick around. You're listening to the Midlife Plot Twist Podcast, and this is episode 31. Hello and happy Monday. I didn't get to wish you happy Monday last week because I started my master's program, so it feels good to be able to wish you a happy Monday today. I'm so excited that my first week of school is done, my first assignments have been handed in, and I'm still feeling inspired and excited about the path ahead. It's been a really good week. Before I get into this week's episode on midlife crisis, I have an exciting announcement. I've been trying to come up with ways to interact with you so that I'm speaking into the void a bit less, and I decided to set up a newsletter. It's called Letters from a Woman in Midlife Crisis. When you subscribe, I'll send you a weekly newsletter that dives into the midlife crisis as it relates to those of us who identify as women. I'll be mailing out my letters every week on Mondays, just like I release the podcast on Mondays. You can subscribe to receive letters from a woman in midlife crisis in a few different ways. First, the direct link will be in the show notes, but you can go to the URL lettersfromamidlifecrisis.beehive, beehiiv.com. You can also head over to my Instagram account, which is at Midlife Plot Twist Podcast, and click on the link tree in my bio. And finally, you can always email me at midlifeplottwistpodcast@gmail.com. Okay, so let's hop into today's topic. If you're around my age, you might picture someone who looks like Don Johnson on the show Miami Vice from the 1980s when you hear the words midlife crisis. That's who I picture anyway. I was just a kid when that show was on TV, but I remember that he was a guy who didn't appear to wear socks ever, who liked wearing sports jackets with t-shirts, and he was cool. If you're younger than me or you just don't know the reference, take a second to Google James Crockett, Miami Vice, and you will see who I'm talking about. That is like the poster child for midlife crisis for me for some reason. Have you noticed that when you Google something, a little drop-down menu comes out of the search box with popular search like items that start with the word you're searching? So this morning when I entered midlife crisis into the Google search bar, the list that came up was as follows: midlife crisis age, midlife crisis meaning, and then it's midlife crisis for women. I was surprised by that. I think I was surprised by it because I thought something about men would come up. And I think I'm venturing a guess to say that many women are starting to wonder about the midlife crisis. And let me tell you, folks, what comes up in the AI-generated overview is very interesting when you go to midlife crisis for women. So I quote, A female midlife crisis, typically ages 35 to 55, is a profound, often hormonally driven perimenopause menopause period of reassessment, causing intense emotional shifts, career changes, or desire for lifestyle overhaul. Triggered by aging, empty nest syndrome, or caregiving burnout, it says. Women often experience depression, anxiety, and a now or never urge to address unmet needs. Here are some common signs and behaviors that this AI overview warns us about. Existential questioning. Frequently asking, is this all there is? Significant emotional shifts. Increased irritability, anxiety, or sadness. Abrupt life changes, such as drastic career shifts, divorce, or changes in appearance or style. Friendship shifts, becoming tired of playing the nurturer role or losing patience with superficial relationships. And finally, burnout, particularly common in Gen X women, it says, due to high expectations and juggling multiple roles. My knee-jerk reaction was to roll my eyes at this and push back on the definition for a whole bunch of reasons. But for right now, I'll just say that I realized this morning that if anyone listened to the details of my life over the past, say, 5 years and saw this definition, they would definitely think that I am in and have been in a midlife crisis. Between the ages of 35 and 55, check. Existential questioning, check. Significant emotional shifts, always. Friendship shifts, check. Burnout, check, check. I will add to this list that this year I will be marrying the love of my life, who is 13 years younger than me. So going for a younger partner, check. And empty nest, check. One of the reasons why my immediate reaction was to push back on the definition was also because I realized that there's a certain stigma associated with people who are going through what we're referring to as a midlife crisis. I've noticed that it's culturally acceptable to casually chuckle and roll our eyes at the old guy driving by in his convertible sports car and think midlife crisis. But there is stigma associated with the midlife crisis. I think we attach negative meaning to it, like there's a sense of shirking one's responsibilities, of not falling in line with cultural and other expectations, of acting like a person younger than our age or stage in life, of dressing differently than the people in our lives are used to, or of starting to exercise for the first time to get fit or lose weight or get strong or all of the above. What is a crisis? Well, if we go back to Google, that AI overview tells us that, the AI overview for this one tells us that a crisis is an unstable, dangerous, or decisive turning point in a situation, such as health, economic, or personal event, where typical coping mechanisms fail, creating intense difficulty or a threat to normal functioning. It's characterized by sudden, unexpected disruption requiring immediate attention and often leading to long-term consequences. Dun, dun, dun. So it's negative. But there are two things I want to say. Number one, I think that at the root of all the possible things going on in what we are labeling to be a midlife crisis is change. And as we all know, change can make people very uncomfortable or even fearful. So maybe it seems like a crisis, and maybe at times it feels like one. But at the end of the day, it's change. Number two, a crisis is characterized by something sudden or unexpected. And I would venture a guess that these situations are neither sudden nor unexpected. Maybe they are for the people in our lives who are onlookers to our midlife crisis. But for those of us going through it, I think there is a feeling that sounds something like, this was a long time coming. I'll say that again. I think the moment in our lives that we're referring to as a midlife crisis is actually change that has been a long time coming. This is why I decided to call this podcast the Midlife Plot Twist instead of the Midlife Crisis. Plot twists are neither negative nor positive, and while plot twists might come as a surprise, once we're in them, we can see the foreshadowing that we missed along the way. So maybe in the case of a midlife crisis, we can look at what's going on and see if there's some foreshadowing going on. But for the sake of everyone knowing what we're talking about here, I'm going to keep referring to the midlife crisis. Had I started recording this podcast 2.5 years ago, I was in a crisis. I was suffering from debilitating burnout and the effects of COVID-19. I could no longer do my job. I didn't want to take any time off of work. I was forced to by my body. I didn't know what I wanted to do anymore. I felt constantly overwhelmed and like my world was falling apart. I resented every responsibility that I had on my shoulders, whether they were real or imagined. I felt very heavily burdened and responsible for way, way too much. I dreamed of my eat, pray, love moment, but I had no ability to imagine where I would go or what I would do other than what I was doing. I also couldn't imagine having the energy to deal with even a fraction of that life overhaul or the travel. I've always been a person who journals, and every single journal entry during that period of time was an attempt to talk myself into wanting to do my job, telling myself that maybe things weren't as bad as I felt they were, or that I could do the thing, I could stick it out, that I really did not feel that I could or wanted to do. When I reflect back on this, though, I would say that my midlife crisis didn't actually start 2.5 years ago. It started probably more like 5 years ago, after the bad breakup of a long-term relationship. All the signs were there for a midlife crisis at that time, too. I dropped a bunch of weight and looked better than I had ever looked in my life. I started doing activities that I hadn't done before and was keeping busy. I was in the best shape of my life. I became a homeowner for the first time in my life. And for the first time in my life, I was truly alone. No child living with me, no partner, just me, and eventually my cat. It was scary, but it was thrilling at the same time. I decided to take a year off of dating, which I talked about in a previous episode, and really started to think about my own needs and desires for my life for the first time. Then, both my parents died. Then, I burned out, got sick, and stopped working. I gained a whole bunch of weight because life became really small and sedentary due to illness and grief. I used food to cope. I started working with a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, a psychotherapist, my family doctor, and some life coaches. Oh, and psychics. I also talked to psychics because why not? About halfway into my sick leave, I started to allow myself to consider the possibility of starting over in my career. I started thinking about returning to university. I shut these ideas down probably hundreds of times because they were terrifying, but they still kept nagging at me. And then I had to get a hysterectomy, which started all kinds of existential questioning, to go back to that Google reference at the beginning. All along, I dreamed of developing and maintaining a life with a slower pace that honors my needs, in which I can take care of myself and the realities of my new disabilities and my new energy envelope. All of that. That was a lot to go through, especially over the course of just 5 years. I think that what the definition of a midlife crisis leaves out is the fact that for many of us, what is called a crisis is actually a breaking point for things that we're no longer tolerating or that were no longer good for us or meant for us. serving us, or true to who we really are. So that could be a relationship of any kind, a career, or a belief system, or some part of our identity. For many of us, what someone might judge to be a midlife crisis is actually a wake-up call. Maybe we've been asleep in our own lives for too long and we haven't been the authors of our own life story. Or as this podcast is called, maybe it's just one plot twist among many in the story of our lives. Just to recap, old Jennifer over here is advocating for us to look deeply at the situations that we're labeling a midlife crisis and instead honor them for what they are. They're probably a midlife long time coming change instead of a midlife crisis. We're reclaiming ourselves. We're maybe restarting some things, and maybe we're having to redo some things too. But I think what is important is these moments are ripe with potential and creative energy. So are you in a midlife crisis? Does any of what I've talked about in this episode resonate with you? If it does, I want to hear from you. Please remember to send me a quick email or a DM at midlifeplottwistpodcast@gmail.com or Midlife Plot Twist Podcast on those social media sites. That's it for this week, my midlife friends. I'm going to keep exploring the midlife crisis, so tune in next week. Until then, be well.